You are standing in front of the bathroom mirror, and you are doing that thing people do when they already late. A quick swipe of mascara, a dab of concealer under the eyes, eyeliner if there is time, and somewhere in the back of your head, a tiny voice says, this is a vanity thing, a modern thing, a thing invented by beauty companies. Here is the secret that voice is wrong about. The little tube in your hand is one of the oldest technologies on Earth. And it didn't start as beauty, it started as survival. By the end of this video, you'll never look at your makeup bag the same way again. That is a promise. Because the real story of cosmetics is hiding in places you would never expect. A jar of black powder that sat in the Louvre for 100 years. A chemistry lab in Paris where ancient eye paint started killing bacteria in a dish. A river that floods every year and turns the whole country into a swamp of flies. And a substance so toxic that modern countries banned it, painted on human eyes for 3,000 years. This is not a story about fashion. It is a story about medicine wearing a disguise. Let us start with the standard story, because it is the one we all grew up with. The standard story says makeup is about beauty. It says people painted their faces to look more attractive, to signal status, to compete for attention. And there is truth in that. Of course, beauty has always been a currency, but the standard story has a hole in it. The oldest cosmetics we have found were not for the face. They were for the eyes, and they were made of lead. Lead, as in the heavy metal that poisons children, that countries ban from paint, from gasoline, from the pipes that carry drinking water. Ancient Egyptians smeared lead-based powder around their eyes, and they did it for thousands of years. Men and women, rich and poor, kings and farmers. If you want to know why, the first thing you have to accept is that they were not stupid. They watched people die from eye infections, generation, and they kept using the same recipe. That should tell you something. The recipe worked. So what exactly were they putting on their eyes? Black eye paint in ancient Egypt came from Galena, which is lead sulfide, a dark mineral that crushes into a fine black powder. Green paint came from malachite, a copper carbonate that grinds to a bright green. People crushed the minerals, mixed them with water or oil or animal fat, and painted a thick line around the eye, extending toward the temples in that dramatic shape you see on every statue and every tomb painting. The shape wasn't just decoration. It framed the eye, made it look bigger and more defined. Modern beauty companies would call that a feature. The Egyptians had a word for it, kohl, and kohl mattered so much that people took pots of it into their graves, so much that the dead went into the tomb wearing it, so much that it shows up in religious texts as a gift from the gods. The Eye of Horus, the symbol that still shows up on jewelry and tattoos today, is literally an eye wearing that line. Here is the part that makes this older than any dynasty. Archaeologists have found flat stone slabs used to grind eye paint. The cosmetic palettes of the prehistoric era in graves that date back to before the pyramids, to a time when Egypt wasn't even one country yet. Around 4000 BCE, people took their grinding stones and their pots of pigment into the grave, the same way later Egyptians carried their best jewelry to the tomb. And the habit didn't stay in Egypt. Kohl traveled. The Babylonians wore it. The Romans adopted it. It spread across the Middle East and into India, where it is still called surma today. Still painted on children's eyes in many communities. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, noticed the eye paint and wrote it down, the way a traveler today might photograph a strange street food. So this is not a lost practice. This is the longest-running cosmetic on the planet, and it never actually went away. How does a cosmetic survive 3,000 years of war, conquest, and changing religion? Because it stopped being decoration long before it reached us. The same black line shows up in the Bible, in the Quran's description of righteous women. in ancient poetry from the Arabian Peninsula, and on the painted gods of Babylon and Crete. And look at what happened to the second color. Green malachite faded out of fashion almost everywhere, while black galena became the global standard. And that tells you something about which ingredient was doing the work. Green was a color choice. Black was a habit, passed from hand to hand, mother to daughter, longer than any empire on the list. Now here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Lead is not a wellness product. In the modern world, lead is one of the most carefully controlled poisons we have. Lead exposure in children damages developing brains. Countries phased out leaded gasoline. Governments banned lead paint. Cities are digging out lead pipes right now, and ancient Egyptians put this stuff on their eyes every single day. If you told a modern doctor that a civilization painted lead onto the eyes, the most delicate organ the body has, for thousands of years, the doctor would assume that civilization died out. It didn't. Egypt lasted 3,000 years and then some. And that paradox, a poison that seemed to keep working, is exactly what a group of French chemists could not leave alone. So why lead of all things? Why the eye and not the lips, not the skin? Back in 2010, a team that included a researcher named Issa Tapsoba, working with chemists in Paris, got access to the Louvre's Egyptian collection. Not reproductions, the actual cosmetic containers, sealed jars with ancient makeup still crusted inside. They scraped out a tiny sample of the black powder, dissolved it in conditions that mimic the human body, the moist surface of the eye, the chemistry of living tissue, and then they added it to cultures of living cells. What happened next made them double-check their instruments. At very low concentrations, the lead compounds in that ancient makeup cause the cells to release nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide is one of the most important molecules in the human immune system. It is a signaling gas that white blood cells use to attack bacteria. It is so central to biology that it won a Nobel Prize in 1998, awarded to Robert Furchgott, Louis Ignarro, and Ferid Murad. The ancient recipe, dissolved in the right conditions, was quietly producing a chemical that fights infection. The makeup was just decoration. It was delivering a tiny, steady dose of an antibacterial compound to the exact place where eye infections begin. Let me be very careful here, because this is where the story can go off the rails. This does not mean lead is good for you. It does not mean the Egyptians invented a safe medicine. High doses of lead are poison. Full stop. The trick, if you can call it that, was dose and chemistry. The Egyptians mixed galena with another lead compound called phosgenite. And that mixture, at the very low concentrations that would actually reach the body, behaved differently than a lump of raw lead. Same element, different outcome. The French team's finding was that the ancient recipe, taken as a whole, works differently than modern people assume any lead compound must work. And here is the part that makes it remarkable. The Egyptians had no idea. They didn't know what a molecule was. They had never heard of nitric oxide, but they had 3,000 years of trial and error. And 3,000 years of trial and error stores a lot of information inside a recipe. If they had gotten the dose wrong, if they had used pure lead and nothing else, the practice would have killed them off, and the recipe would have died with them. So what was the actual trick inside the recipe? The French team dug deeper, and the answer is stranger than lead kills bacteria. The Egyptians did not use raw galena alone. They mixed it with another lead compound called phosgenite, a mineral that forms when galena sits in contact with the salts of the desert and the river. In the right proportions, that mixture breaks down slowly on a wet surface, releasing lead ions a little at a time instead of all at once. The chemists who analyzed the Louvre jars found that the ancient ratio was not random. It produced at the surface of the eye just enough of the antibacterial compound to matter without a sudden toxic dump. In other words, 3,000 years of trial and error had accidentally tuned a dosage. The Egyptians had discovered the difference between a poison and a medicine, which is almost always a question of quantity, and they had stored that knowledge inside a cosmetic. Now, why would anyone need antibacterial eye makeup in the first place? The answer is the river. Every year, the Nile flooded, and the flood was a gift and a curse. It watered the fields and made Egypt rich. It also turned the land into a breeding ground for flies. Millions of them, everywhere, all season, and flies land on everything. Food, dead animals, open wounds, human eyes. Eye disease in ancient Egypt was everywhere. The medical papyri describe eye infections constantly, with dozens of recipes for treating them. The most common cause of blindness in the region, trachoma, is an infection spread by flies. And it was so common in Egypt that European doctors later gave it the nickname Egyptian ophthalmia. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, thousands of his soldiers went blind or half-blind from the disease, and it followed his army back to Europe. Trachoma is still around today, still one of the world's leading infectious causes of blindness. So if you live in a world where your eyes are under constant attack by disease-carrying insects, a small dark line of antibacterial paste around the eye starts to look less like fashion and more like a fence. Here is how bad it got. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical scroll written around 1550 BCE, lists dozens of remedies for the eyes, from honey pastes to onion juice to ground minerals, and the eye complaints are so routine that they read like the cold section of a modern pharmacy. Every flood season brought a new wave of the same problems, and every flood season brought the same response. More paste, applied earlier, to more faces. In that world, a line of paste that slowed infection and cut glare was not an accessory. It was equipment. There is another theory too, and it is a good one. Black around the eye cuts glare. Players smear dark streaks under their eyes on sunny days, and athletes swear it helps them track the ball. In Egypt, the sun doesn't politely shine. It detonates off sand, off water, off pale limestone, and the reflected light hits you from every direction, including from below, where the lower eyelid sits. A dark line under the eye absorbs some of that bounce instead of letting it hammer your retina. So the same swipe that kept flies and bacteria away may also have worked like a pair of sunglasses. Thousands of years before glass lenses existed. 3 jobs. 1 black line. That is not just cosmetics. That is a pocket multi-tool for the face. Quick aside, because this is the kind of fact I cannot keep to myself. The modern beauty industry spent the last decade convincing you that clean and non-toxic are the highest compliments a product can earn. And that is probably true for most of what sits on the shelf. Meanwhile, the single most successful cosmetic in human history was built from the one ingredient modern regulators spent 50 years ripping out of paint, gasoline, and pipes. Somewhere, a marketing intern is getting a headache just reading this. Anyway, back to the eyes. And yes, before you say it, the winged eyeliner that eats 40 minutes of every beauty tutorial on the internet is the direct descendant of that ancient line. You are not drawing a cat eye. You are drawing a prescription. The beauty industry has spent a century and a fortune trying to convince you that eyeliner is a statement of personality. It is older than personality. It is older than cities. It is a medicine cabinet that got promoted to fashion. And honestly, the promotion worked so well that nobody remembers the original job. And the funny part is that the modern version kept the shape and moved the chemistry into the tube. So the line on your face is mostly theatre, while the preservatives quietly do the ancient job behind the scenes. The ritual stayed. Let me put a person in that world because the numbers don't do it justice. Imagine an Egyptian farmer on the floodplain, say 4,000 years ago, standing at the edge of his field at sunrise. The flood water is still draining, the mud is thick, and the air is already buzzing. Flies are on his face before he finishes waking up. They land on his eyelids, on the corners of his mouth, on the same patch of skin, over and over. He reaches into a small clay pot tied at his waist, dips a finger into the black paste, and draws a line under each eye, careful and unhurried, the way a modern person applies sunscreen. Then he does the same for his children, crouching down, holding their chins still, painting the line over their eyes while they squirm. He is not thinking about beauty. He is not thinking about status. He is thinking about the neighbor whose eyes went white and cloudy last harvest, and the one before that, and the one before that. The paste is part of his routine, like drinking water or checking the nets. And the strange thing is, it probably helped. Not perfectly, not for everyone, but enough, often enough, that the recipe never went away. 3,000 years of people choosing the same black line is not a fashion trend. That is a working drug. And then there is the layer that is hardest for a modern audience to take seriously, the religious one, and it matters more than you think. The Egyptians didn't separate medicine and magic the way we do. For them, an infection was just an infection. It was an enemy with a name, a demon that slipped in through openings, and the eye was the most open thing about a person. The goddess Wadjet, whose symbol was the cobra, was literally the goddess of the eye, and her image guarded kings. The eye of Horus, torn out in a myth and restored by the god Thoth, became the most common amulet in Egypt, worn for healing and protection, and the black line around the human eye was a small daily version of that amulet. Babies got the line painted on almost from birth, because a child's eye was the most vulnerable entrance of all. So when a mother drew that line on her child, she was doing 3 things at once: applying sun protection, applying insect protection, and writing a protective spell with a finger. The medicine and the prayer were the same gesture. You can pull them apart. Here is the bigger picture, and it changes how you see the entire history of beauty. The oldest cosmetics we know of were medicine first. Beauty came later as a side effect of survival. The Egyptians did not invent eyeliner because they wanted to look mysterious. They invented eyeliner because they wanted to see tomorrow. And the same pattern runs through the whole history of cosmetics. Scented oils first masked the smell of disease. Face paint covered damaged skin. Perfume was insect repellent before it was romance. The history of beauty is the history of people trying not to die, with better marketing attached. Every beauty company on earth is selling a descendant of a survival tool, whether they know it or not. Here is where the story loops back to the mirror, and it is the strangest loop of all. Modern cosmetics removed the lead, of course, and that was correct. But the antibacterial function never left the industry. Look at the ingredients in your mascara or your concealer, and you'll find preservatives, and preservatives exist for one reason: to stop bacteria from growing in the tube and then in your eye. That is the same problem the Egyptians were solving, with the same goal, just with chemicals we understand better. Meanwhile, the beauty industry spends billions convincing you that a new serum will transform your skin, and the most honest sentence in the entire industry is the one printed in tiny letters on the back of the box. The preservative system protects against microbial contamination. They still selling eye protection. They just wrapped it in fragrance and marketing and forgot the Nile. Sound familiar? Same war, newer weapons. The preservatives in your mascara are fighting the same microbes the Egyptians fought, and the people who formulate them are the direct descendants of the people who tuned the Galena ratio. They just have a lab and a label requirement. Now let's be honest about the other side, because the full truth is not a fairy tale. The Egyptian recipe had costs. Lead is lead. People who used that makeup for decades absorbed lead into their bodies, and it may have contributed to health problems that mummies can only hint at. Some scholars think the eye paint caused real harm, and they may be right. The evidence for harm and the evidence for benefit are not symmetrical. The antibacterial effect is real. The French team demonstrated it in a Paris lab in 2010, but it does not erase the toxicity. And please, do not go buy lead eye makeup online. Because of this video, that would be missing the point entirely. The honest version of this story is that the Egyptians built a working recipe by accident, inside a system that also hurt them, and the recipe kept going because the benefit was visible. That is how most ancient medicine worked. Trial and error. No theory. Results you could see with your own eyes. So was it a medicine? A poison? The answer is yes, which is exactly what makes the story human. Every ancient pharmacy worked that way. Something that healed one patient could poison the next one, and nobody could explain why. So they hedged their bets with prayer, amulets, and careful handed-down proportions. The line between cure and poison was a memory, not a formula. So here's the sentence this whole video has been building toward. Makeup wasn't born from vanity. It was born from medicine. Humans wanted to survive first. Looking good came second. Next time you are standing in front of the bathroom mirror, late again, swiping mascara with one hand, look at what is in your hand for a second. That little tube is not a modern invention. It is a very old habit wearing a very modern label, and the line you are drawing around your eye, the one you learned from 100 tutorials, is the same line an Egyptian farmer drew on his children at sunrise 4,000 years ago, while the flies buzzed and the river rose. The packaging is new, the medicine is ancient, and the reason you still reach for it every morning is the same reason he did. They got things to see.